Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you happen to be joining us from. This is Jim McKeith, Chief Developer Advocate for Embarcadero Technologies, and thanks for joining us for this FireDeck Enterprise Connector Spotlight on SurveyMonkey and Twilio. I will be presenting this session live today, so do please ask your questions as we go along. I probably get most of the questions at the end, but I'll try and keep an eye on it as well if there's a question that I am not. If there are some questions I may be able to address as we go, but most questions I will address at the end. But the microphone will remain muted, and this session is being recorded, and a replay will be available later. You should find the question panel on the right there, where you can ask questions as we go along. And I see a question already from Peter. Good evening. Thanks, Peter. Glad you could join us. As I said, my name is Jim McKeith. I'm the Chief Developer Advocate and Engineer here at Embarcadero Technologies. Been a long time Delphi developer, number of platforms, tools, and languages, and been with Embarcadero for a number of years now. Very excited to be here and excited to continue to be part of this amazing community. Agenda today, we're going to talk about introduction to the FireDeck Enterprise connectors, and also then specifically about Twilio and SurveyMonkey with the details about each, what you need to do to connect to them, how you use them, and such. And then also just how to get your free license, which hopefully you are all excited about that. So before we really get into enterprise connectors, we understand the idea of software as a service. This was kind of a big shift a number of years ago, and the idea is that instead of buying the software, instead you're using the software as a service. Now, for some things like Microsoft Word, that's the kind of classic example, it kind of makes sense that you want to have it on your computer, or your development tools, you want to have those installed on your computer as software. But where you have software that is attached to services, then it really makes sense that you have the software as a service with that. So for example, SurveyMonkey and Twilio. SurveyMonkey provides a survey platform, Twilio provides communication. So where the use of building a survey is much more useful when there is a service attached to it, when the user can visit a website. That way you don't have to maintain the website as well as the software and make the survey and stuff like that. So what it does is just a way for you to offload some of your effort, some of your upkeep to the provider so that they can take care of that for you. But what does that mean about all the data? Now, if you're at all like me, back in the day, all my data was in a database on a server that I could connect to and get access to. Granted, there may be a DBA between me and the data, and I may have to talk to them nicely to get the access I need, but at the end of the day, all the data is in-house, and we, the company, owns that data. Today, the data is everywhere. It's no longer always in-house because we're using these software as a service providers. It's a great advantage to be able to take advantage of these, but it still means it's harder to get to your data because it's no longer in-house, it's no longer on a database you control, on a server you own. So here's some examples. Some of your data may be on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. It could be on local databases, SQL Server, Oracle, MongoDB, and it could be on big data systems. Oracle or Google hosts Bigtable, Amazon hosts things, Microsoft has a number of services, etc. So there's lots of options out there for where your data might be. Accounting systems, QuickBooks Online, FreshBooks, ERP, employee relationships programs, I believe correctly, Jira, SAP, no, ERP, that's not what it is. I always forget that acronym. I know what it is, but I forget it. CRM is customer relationship management. ERP, so we use Jira here at Embarcadero. A lot of people use SAP. MailChimp, I've used MailChimp before in the past, great email management system, Salesforce, Sugar CRM, etc. So lots of these different platforms exist out there where your data might be. So this brings us to APIs. Everything has an API. All these SAS, software as a services, enterprise resource planning. Thank you, Doug. Yes, ERP is enterprise resource planning. I always try and make it into CRM. Anyway, so APIs. All of these software as a services have an API. Pretty much everything anymore has an API. Every API is different. It's like your fingerprint or your DNA, right? As every human being has DNA and a fingerprint, every software as a service has an API. There are a few that don't have APIs, and they don't get very big uptake because of that, unfortunately. And the other thing about APIs is that they're always changing and evolving. There's new versions coming out. They're pretty dynamic in the way they work. So APIs are what give you the ability to connect to these things, and those cloud platforms, these software as a service providers, these APIs are the new building blocks for software solutions. So what this means is that you can consume the infrastructure and services provided by them instead of building them yourself, right? So instead of setting up your own servers and managing these servers and managing your own network connections and so on and so forth, which you still need to have some of those, but the majority of that, can be managed by the providers. So you, as the developer, combine these APIs and services to solve your business needs. So you focus on the business need, what's the goal you're trying to accomplish, and then you let somebody else take care of the surveys, of the communication and stuff like that. They focus on what they're good at, you focus on what you're good at. Brad Studio, Delphi, and C++ Builder give you a REST client library, enterprise connectors, and a lot of other great features in order to make it easy for you to take advantage of these building blocks to connect to these services and APIs. Speaking of, FireDAC is, everybody knows FireDAC is, well, hopefully you know, FireDAC is the best database framework for connecting to local databases, right? So if you're local MongoDB, local Oracle, or remote Oracle database on a server, whatever it is, these traditional databases, relational database management systems, or even MongoDB and others, FireDAC is fantastic for that. Now, there's a lot of other great database frameworks out there. I'm not trying to diss those, but FireDAC is amazing. If you're not using it yet, you really should take a look at it. It's included in the box with your license and just really can make a big difference in your development. If you still have some code that's written in BDE, for example, we do have a refined utility to migrate from BDE to FireDAC. There's lots of resources about that as well. I'm not going to get that today. But FireDAC enterprise connectors extend the power of FireDAC to everywhere the data is hiding, all these different APIs, all these different software as a services, all these different platforms. You can use your traditional SQL 92 compliant queries to access all this data everywhere. So the cool thing is you can do, so with FireDAC Local SQL, which is one of my favorite features of all time, you could do a join between data coming from two different data sources, right? So you could do a join, or multiple data sources. I did a webinar a while back on the local SQL and did a join between 5 different data sources from 5 different databases using 5 different data sets, and joined them all together. It might have been more than 5 actually, I think about it. Joined them all together into one result set. So you could do a join, let's say for example, you had email addresses that were the same across a survey and maybe Twilio and maybe something else. You could do a join across all of these into one local data set. Very powerful ability because it's all connected through FireDAC. So let's talk about the FireDAC enterprise connectors. These were built in a collaboration between Embarcadero and CData. CData is based around See the World as a database. Embarcadero, of course, you're familiar with enterprise strong development tools that hopefully you all are using. FireDAC enterprise connectors are designed to be developer friendly. If you've used any database connection technology on our developer tools in the past, you know how to use the FireDAC enterprise connectors. They're full design time support for data. Basically, just like you would use them to connect to any other database, you can use the FireDAC enterprise connectors to connect to these services. They have all the security functionality you need built into them with SSL, TLS, data encryption, etc. And they also support advanced features like replication and caching, so that if you need to move large groups of data or replicate data from these enterprise connectors, you can certainly do that as well. Very customizable. You can customize them to quite extensively to change the way they work. This isn't something I've gotten into yet, but it's something they've covered quite a bit in their documentation. They have a lot of great documentation on all these connectors, which I'll provide you links to as well. And other thing that's really important, as I mentioned, APIs are regularly updated. They are regularly updating the enterprise connectors. CData has a number of products across a number of different development tools beyond the FireDAC enterprise connectors, and they are working with a lot of customers to make sure that their APIs or their connectors work across all these APIs. They support a lot of them, and they're always testing them and updating them. They have annual regular updates where they release a whole new version, but then as needed, they will release bug fixes to address API changes, new features, etc. So if you follow their blog, you can see when things are updated from there. Also, they're available through a royalty-free distribution license. So there's other solutions out there where you're paying a per user license, whereas the enterprise connectors are royalty-free license, per developer license. So if you're on Update subscription attending this webinar, you will receive the 2 free licenses for Twilio and SurveyMonkey, and you can use those licenses to create applications. You'll get a RTK, runtime key, that you need to put into your component so that the license, so it's connected to your license. Once you do that, then those components will work for as many users as you want to give them to. Now, the ability to build that, the license to build the code, is tied to you and your license you receive, but the ability to run it is unlimited. It's royalty free. When your license expires after a year, you can renew that license in order to continue building it, but your applications you've built prior to the licensing expiring will continue to work after that period. So we'll look at using the enterprise connectors. They use the standard FireDAC components, TFD manager, TFD connection, TFD query, etc. By default, you need to put it on TFD connection, which actually has a manager behind the scenes, but if you don't want to mess with that, you don't have to. Then you can either put down an FD connect query to run the queries, or you can execute SQL directly through the FD connection. All the connectors are installed as an additional FizzLink component. The FireDAC, the later version of FireDAC, you don't have to put down the FizzLink component. It does that automatically, but there is a FizzLink component you can put down that will have be available for the different connectors, enterprise connectors you put on. Once you've put them down, all you have to do is set the driver ID to one of the drivers, and then you just are ready to go. So there's the links right there to download the trials. If you want to take a look at some of the other trials beyond Twilio or SurveyMonkey, once you receive your license, you can download the full versions, and there's the link to the extensive documentation. One note is most of these, because you're connecting to a service, you will need an API key or something along those lines in order to connect that to the account you set up so that it has the right permissions. Let's talk about SurveyMonkey. SurveyMonkey is a platform for creating surveys. Embarcadero has been using this for years, not exclusively. It's not the only survey platform we use, but chances are you may have received a survey from us that used SurveyMonkey. They have a free tier to get started, but then most likely if you're doing something bigger with more complex, you're probably gonna want one of their paid tiers. They have a lot of great functionality for creating really complex surveys with page logic and stuff like that. And then they have the ability to send out these surveys either via email or links, social media, collect the results back in, and then give you some tools for now analyzing those and seeing what the result sets look like. They have a lot of services beyond that as well, but that's kind of the basics of it. So in order to work with SurveyMonkey, you first need to go to developer.surveymonkey.com and sign up for a developer account, and then you can create an app. Now, from what I was looking at this, it looks like you can create a private app, which is built for you and your team for free. But if you want to put it in the app directory, it looks like you need to have a different license key to do that. Certainly check out SurveyMonkey for more information on that. That's just my understanding, and it may be completely incorrect, unfortunately. Once you've created an app, you're going to want to set the OAuth redirect URL. So example here, I used 33333. You could use any port number, but it needs to be a localhost port that's available on your computer. you can, as long as it's both set the same on SurveyMonkey, on the API, on the developer, on the console, and in your application, it's the same. It's fine. You also need to specify the scopes. So the scopes are what, when somebody signs in, authorizes your application to work, what are they given access to? So one thing that's important is frequently, if you're doing this for your own use, you're going to have essentially one account, but two different ways you use it. One account to set up the developer backend. And then when you run the application, you're going to log in using your credentials as a user account. Now, potentially that could be a different user on your team or an entirely different user if it's a public app account or public app that's being used by other users outside of your organization. So that you're think about that. There's two different things there. So you're going to get the let's see, the client ID and secret. Those are the ones that are tied to your developer account. But then when the user logs in, they're going to provide their username and password, which is where this comes in here. This is what that user is giving you permission to read from their account, the scopes. These are the scopes, minimum scopes required, but depending on what your application is going to do, you may need additional scopes. So you just come in here and select those and update. If you do update that later, which you can, then the user will be required to reauthorize when they use your application again. So you're going to install the connector, put an FD connection down on your form, put in the client ID and secret, which I've hidden here. You're going to change initiate OAuth to get and refresh. One note about this is if you are only using this for your own internal reporting, which is incredibly powerful if you're using SurveyMonkey to be able to pull the data out the way you want it, then you can actually get an OAuth access token from the SurveyMonkey's website and use that instead, and then you don't have to have the initiate OAuth turned on or the callback URL. What it does, it just generates a token that only you can use. There's a lot of other settings in here. If you scroll down, is where the RTK is, which is the runtime key, which you'll need to provide, which is installed on your computer in a text file when you install the connectors. These are the views that are available through SurveyMonkey that you can use. These are read-only that you can read to get information. These are collectors, are the things that you use to collect survey responses. Contacts are the people that you have in your database that you can send messages out to. So for example, SurveyMonkey maintains a list of contacts that you send your surveys to. Roll-ups are the stats and information for surveys. Survey questions, so survey questions and survey responses, these are I'll talk about these in the next slide. Every survey has a questions and responses. So if you have a survey named My Amazing Survey, you'll have a table or review called My Amazing Survey _questions, and also one _responses, and those are how you access the stuff specific to that survey. So here's an example of how you would query all the questions from your survey. Select star from, and then My Survey for Fun _questions, and the yellow responses. Select star from that should be a V. I was like, what in the world is that? Survey about programming responses. To get a list of all the surveys, you would just call get table names. CData is the namespace. I can't remember right. Anyway, CData SurveyMonkey. If you don't put this in here, it'll give you all of them, but you can scope it down with this. And then here, this is where you can put a pattern match in there. So if you only wanted to get the questions or responses, you do %_ responses or %_ questions, just like you would using like pattern matching. I opened a link instead of advancing to the next slide. Weird. Okay, so for more information about SurveyMonkey, here's some links for you here. I'll give you these slides here shortly at the end. Here's where you can download the trial or the full version. Is a tutorial on how to build a simple VCL application, viewing the data in the Data Explorer. the full documentation, and here's a link to the SurveyMonkey Developer Console. I see a couple questions here on SurveyMonkey. Questionnaires that are strictly confidential, like medical or nutrition surveys. I'm not sure, Alfie, you would need to check with SurveyMonkey for that. I know they have a lot of different options, and I imagine this is something they've tackled, but you would really need to talk to them specifically. Yes, so if you are connecting to multiple databases that are encrypted, or different data sources that are encrypted with different systems, you certainly can do that. You would need to the user would need to go through and authenticate to each one of those individually, or those credentials would need to be in your application. Then once you make that connection, then you could then use the local SQL to join all of those together. Absolutely. Now let's talk about Twilio. I've actually used Twilio in the past, and then also used it with the enterprise connectors. Built a little simple sample application in one afternoon. It actually wasn't just a sample application. It was my dad has a band, and his band wanted to be, they were putting up say, hey, if you want to make a request at the when they're doing a performance, they had said just send a text this number. But the problem was that, you know, then you have to pull out your phone and pass, you know, find out what the request was. So when he came over, he's like, oh, this isn't working for me. I said, well, come on over, let's see if we can figure something out. And so I went out, signed up for Twilio, got a free account to start with, and then set up setting up a paid service. It was really cheap. He was like, oh yeah, no problem. And just a little application that would, we got a phone number from Twilio. People could just text that number and set up a little application that just pulls all the requests that come in from that number, all the messages that come in, displays them on the screen, and refreshes on a regular interval. And then you actually had the ability also to send a response back to them saying, oh, great, we'll get that played next or whatever for you. And it literally just took me like an afternoon to put this together really easily. And I wrote that, and he's been using it regularly, like for a year now, I think. So anyway, it works really good, really easy to get you started with. So Twilio provides cloud communications platform. They provide, originally started out with SMS, but then they added voice calls and now video calls. But I haven't looked into the voice calls and video calls side of things, but the SMS functionality is widely used across a number of services. Chances are, if you've ever gotten a text message with your key that you need to use to validate your two-factor authentication type thing, it went through Twilio. It's really, really popular service out there. So again, you go to the Twilio Developer Console, because Twilio is like a B2B or B2D platform, right? They're completely focused on developers using their API. You go to their homepage and it's like, hey, get a free key here. And you just go through, and it's very straightforward. There's not like hiding the developer page like a lot of other sites do. Once you do that, you need to get your account SID and an auth token, then put those into your FD connection, and you're ready to go. Here's the tables that are available in Twilio. Right here, messages. There's where you can create, update, and query SMS and MMS messages in Twilio. You have incoming phone numbers, calls, applications, recordings. So you can see the recordings, people called and left messages, transcriptions of recordings, so on and so forth. Additional views you have here, available phone numbers. These are the phone numbers that you can use through Twilio, incoming phone numbers, and usage records. This is based on how much you used. And then here's what you would do, the use the store procedure to add a new caller ID to your account so that you could make send a message from that caller ID, if you will. These are the example queries I used in that quick application I wrote for my father. Just select star from messages, where 2 equals, that's not the actual number I used, but once you sign up with Twilio, you can get a phone number and people can text that number, and then you just say, hey, give me all the messages sent to that number. You could also say where from equals that. And so that would give you a listing of all your outgoing messages. To send a message, all you do is insert into messages to sender body, and boom, it goes out. It's really that easy. It was, like I said, in an afternoon, put this together, and it was working, and we were sending and receiving messages with that. Although, actually, now that I think about it, I don't think I ever put anything in there to delete old messages. I'm not sure what the retention is on that, so he may have a huge backlog of messages that he's received on his system. But So for more information about Twilio, you can go out there. There's the link for the overview and download. You can view the tutorial on how to view Twilio data in RAD Studio Data Explorer, how to build a simple VCL application for Twilio. The full documentation, very good. Actually, when you install it, you get a link, you get a local copy of the documentation as well. You can use that or the one on the website, either one's fine. And then there's a link to the Twilio developer console. It doesn't look like there's any questions on Twilio. This is a really powerful one. I was actually kind of excited that these were the two we're starting with, because I think these are things a lot of people can use. They have free options for you to get started using them, and something I think you could take a lot of advantage of in your applications you're developing. So let's talk about getting your free licenses. So we're going to have these going forward, 2 connectors highlighted and spotlighted each month, and a webinar like this one you're on now, where you can receive your free license. The requirements to receive your free license are: 1, you need to be on active update subscription. 2, you need to sign up for the webinar, which if you're here, congratulations. And 3, when you signed up for the webinar, it asked you for the email address associated with update subscription if it's different than the one you used to sign up for the webinar. So you need to provide that email address there, because that's how we can verify that you are on update subscription. You will receive an email to the associated email address, the email address associated with that subscription, with your 2 license keys in it. If you're attending the webinar live, you will receive it the next few days. If you are watching the replay, we will do a periodic email out, probably once a week. I want to say, if you sign up more than a month later, we may not get to those. Hopefully, sign up right away. I know you're here. If you're listening to this, you either signed up on time or not, but do sign up right away so we can make sure we get you those license keys for those. If you don't receive the license key, make sure your update subscription's active. Talk to sales. They can figure out what's going on. Maybe it's a different email address than you realize that's associated with it. And then make sure you provided the correct email address when registering. So if you talk to sales and they're like, oh, it's under this other email address instead of your email address, then register for the replay again using the correct email address, and we can make that connection and get you that license key. Once you receive the license keys, you can go out to the website, you download the full version. It'll ask you for your email address and your license key. Once you download it, it will ask you, when you're installing it the first time, the first one you install, it'll ask you for your license key and your information. Provide that there. And once you provide that there, it will save that license information locally, and then when you install the second one, it'll say, hey, you have an existing license locally, do you want to use that? Just say yes, and it will install and work with that. Let's see, questions here. Yes, I hope, yes, very exciting to Sunil, to be educated on this topic. These are really powerful. I've talked to a lot of people that have used these very successfully for a number of different projects. And my experience has been their support is very responsive, and everybody I've talked to that's used it also has found the support very responsive. So if you do use it and you do run into issues, if you contact CData support, they're really quick to get back to you and help things out. If there's a bug, they get it fixed. And yeah, they're really great components. So Doug's asking, does the active update requirement exclude on longer term? I'm not sure, Doug. I will, let me make a note here. Wrongful window. Doug, I will make a note to find out how that works. Because, yeah, I'm not sure how that works. Are there limits on the free license? So the free license, as I understand it, is a full license just for those 2 keys. So you're going to receive 2 keys, one for Twilio, one for SurveyMonkey, and the license you receive is a full 1-year license, just as if you'd bought those 2 keys. Then you can use those licenses for those 2 products as much as you want to. Obviously, the hope is that you're going to start using these and say, oh my goodness, these enterprise connectors are amazing. How have I lived without them? I must buy them all. If you don't, that's fine. it'd be great if you did, and then you can buy the other ones. But if you don't buy the other ones, you can still keep using these. Like I said, you can continue to develop with them for 1 year. After 1 year, your projects will keep working, provided you put the runtime key, RTK, in the connection manager before and built your project before your license expired. We have 2 developers and an update subscription that covers 2 licenses. Should be able to get 2 licenses. Yes, Gary, you should be able to get 2 licenses. We are still trying to figure some of this out. I'm making a note here about your email address, and hopefully we can make sure that gets connected. If you don't, then do let us know, and we'll get that taken care of. It should be, the limit should be, you should be able to get 1. If you have 2 update subscriptions, you should be able to get 2 sets of license keys for the enterprise connectors. Do the other CDA connectors work the same? I'm interested in Shopify and Magneto. Yes, they do. They work. You're going to have some subtle differences. So as you noticed, the in the Twilio or the SurveyMonkey one, you had to set the OAuth to update and refresh, or anyway, you have to set, some of the settings are different as far as how it connects. So for example, when a user runs your SurveyMonkey built application, they're going to have to log in if you did not provide that token saying it's just for your use. The user will have to provide the login credentials. So that'll change based on which one you're using, right? So SurveyMonkey, you had to put localhost and the OAuth callback URL. Twilio, you didn't. Okay, so I'm not sure how Shopify and Magneto work, whether they require you to have the OAuth callback or whatever. The documentation will cover that. Read the documentation. It's going to talk about all the different connection options and such, but then essentially it's going to be the same. You're going to go to the services, set up the API keys, put the API keys into your connection string with the information on how to connect to it, and run it. Yeah, so also one note is I know that like Magneto, I'm not sure if it's a service that someone running on someone else's server or your server. If it is running on your server, then you would have to set up the API key within the server that you have set up, for example. There are some that the enterprise connectors that work with self-hosted solutions as well as cloud-hosted solutions. So if it's self-hosted, you're still going to have some sort of process you go through to authorize it to work with that solution. That's what I'm trying to say. Question: is there a source of information for best practices with Delphi for secure key and password storage and handling? That's a really good question. So there's as far as using it with the enterprise connectors, your that's a good question, Doug. So you should never save them in plain text, obviously, but if you're putting them in your application in the connection manager, they are being saved as strings within your application itself. So best practices is you should not deploy an application that has those keys in there. So the best practice, absolute best practice, Doug, would be that you set up a RAD server instance that has those keys and passwords within it, okay? And then your users would then authenticate against that, and then that would then authenticate against the SurveyMonkey, for example. Okay, so then you don't have your keys distributed to your users. Beyond that, I mean, you don't want to save passwords, right? So if a user's giving you a username and password, you never, ever, ever save a password. If you're saving a password, you're doing it wrong. If it's a user's password, you should never save an encrypted password. You should save a one-way algorithm hash of a password using like bcrypt or some of these other systems that are built specifically around the idea of protecting passwords. So that's the best best practice, Doug, most likely you want to deploy an application to your users that has that in there, and you're not going to want to send it through your own RAD server instance because, reasons. In that case, you probably want to at least do some minor level encryption on your keys in your application and not just store them in the properties there. There might be some information from CData on that. I have not looked into that, to be honest, recently on that specifically, but you could do some encryption on the keys themselves so that they're not stored in plain text, which would then make them at least obscure them a little bit. Although the reality is, once you give somebody that, if they are persistent enough, they will find those keys. So like I said, best practice, don't ever give them the exe with the keys in it. Hopefully that helps some, Doug. Gary's asking, once you've purchased Enterprise Connectors Plus license after the free year, does the license work the same way as the free one? You can build EXEs for a year and then no longer. Okay, yes. So if you purchase the full Enterprise Connectors or Enterprise Connectors Plus, you receive a 1-year license. And that year includes all the updates that come in that year, which is important because these are updated regularly because these APIs are changing, and the ability to build during that year. Now you will have an RTK runtime key that comes with each of those connectors you install. You'll take that runtime key, put it into your connection manager, and then once the license expires, you no longer can build, but your applications will continue to run. But you can then renew your subscription and continue to build, get the newer versions and such. So while yes, your applications, your runtime key allows it to continue to run, because APIs are changing, it's conceivable the APIs could change and render your application unfunctional because the API has changed and you would need to rebuild it. Most of these providers typically try to degrade gracefully when their APIs change and make sure it's backwards compatible, but they usually only do that for a couple years at most, usually, and then they're like, okay, now you have to switch to the new API. So yes, it will keep working, but the license will not cause them to quit working, but the APIs change may. Peter's saying, as I can see, I can buy either the 70 pack or the 130 pack, cannot buy a single connector such as Twilio. Peter, there are conversations around changing the way the licensing works. That may change within the next year. If not, so I've talked to a number of people that have used these, and they said buying the full pack is still a good value for only using the one connector because of what you get out of it and just the amount of work it saves you. And that was kind of the thought in building these packs, is that they would just be an incredibly good value that you could use, that it would be worth it for you. That may change within the next year. It may be available in smaller packs or as individuals. Talk to sales and product management and let them know how you would like to see that going forward. But for now, you do receive you're receiving the individual license keys. This is something new we had set up. I had to work with CData to get these set up as individual licenses because it's not something they previously did. And I see Peter commented that he does agree that he has bought Enterprise Connectors Plus. Yeah, everybody I've talked to that has bought the Enterprise Connectors or Enterprise Connectors Plus pack and used it said it's an amazing deal for what you get, the amount of power you have here, and how much time it's going to save you. Let's see. If an application has a key and the API gets updated, do we need to recompile and distribute the app each time there is changes in an API? Maybe, Alf. It really depends. If the API change is not part of the API you're using, don't need to recompile. If that a new feature you're not using, don't need to recompile. If the API changes in such a way that your old application no longer works, right? So they maybe they've deprecated the old interfaces and made new interfaces, or completely retired the old interfaces and made new interfaces. Usually that's what happened. They'll say, hey, we're deprecating these interfaces. Here's the new interfaces. We're going to switch over to these in a year or two. And then in a year or two, they're going to say, okay, the deprecated interfaces are being shut off on this date, and you need to be using new interfaces. So if something like that happens, then yeah, you would need to recompile. But if it's just a matter of them adding a new interface that you're not wanting to take advantage of, or something changes you're not using, then you do not need to recompile. Okay, well, it looks like that's it for questions. If I missed your question, I apologize. I will do my best to try and actually go back through these and make sure I didn't miss anything. Is there a typically buy build trade-off? Yeah, Gary, so you could build these yourself. You could build these yourself. Actually, I mentioned the REST client library that we include with Delphi C++ Builder and Rad Studio. I've used that a lot. There's some services out there that we don't have enterprise connectors for, that I've used to build to connect these two. It is a lot of work. I don't consider myself that brilliant of a developer, and I was able to figure it out going through the documentation and testing it a lot. The reality is, though, that it was a lot of work, and if you are you could build it yourself, but at some point you need to do the math and decide what is an hour of your time worth versus buying the things. One thing I tell people all the time is that I'll get someone that says, hey, I want to be able to do X with Delphi C++ Builder Rad Studio. And I'm like, well, here's a third-party component that does that, and reasonably priced. And they're like, yeah, but I want to be able to do it without buying that component. I'm like, well, if there's a component for it, you can do that yourself within Delphi C++ Builder and Rad Studio. I mean, those components were written with what you just bought, so you can do that without buying it. Now you got to decide how much your time's worth. So it's a build versus buy trade-off, right? You could build these yourself, but it takes time to build them the first time and to test them, and they will change, so you have to maintain them. So between those three things, taking advantage of the enterprise connectors can be huge savings. If depending, I mean, if you're like, hey, I've got an army of affordable developers working for me, I'll just have them do it. Fantastic, you can do that, and you don't have to buy them. But just be aware that they will be updating those frequently. Okay, so that was actually, here's questions and answers. We've covered those already. Like I said, thank you for giving me regards. Oh, absolutely. I will be glad to tell everybody how much you appreciate it. I think these are really exciting components. I'm really excited about these. It took me a while to figure out wrap my head around them, and now I'm always excited to tell people about them, because, as I said earlier, these services and these APIs are really the new building blocks, right? It used to be, you wanted a component, it was all about buttons and list boxes and stuff. Now, still buttons and list boxes are important, but it's how can I connect those to these services out there to really deliver to my users the features and functions they need. And it's great to have this that makes it so much easier to do. Glenn just said, on the build versus buy, remember developers cost about $1,000 per day. In Australia, if you spend 2 days writing a component, that is $2,000. Yep, absolutely. You're gonna if you develop these in house, you're gonna totally pay way more than you should have for that. For encrypting passwords in Delphi, there are many libraries. One of the populars is Decrypt. Yes. And here's a link to the updated version. Fantastic. Thank you, Miguel. I will send that out to everybody. There's the link to do Decrypt if you're wanting to store passwords. There's a lot of good options out there, so take a look at that. Another link. Thanks. If you use the connector, is there much more to learn beyond simple SQL phrases you were throwing at the API through FireDeck? So you will need to understand what you're connecting to, right? So for example, with SurveyMonkey, right, you need to understand that there are views for each survey you have. So you need to understand what is a view or what is a survey, right? You need to understand that surveys have questions and responses and such. And then when you read the documentation, it will talk to you about things like, so for example, you like for messages in the Twilio, you need to always specify in your select statement, you need to specify either a from or a to. You can't just do a select star from messages. You need to look for messages either being sent to somebody or from somebody, for example. And all that's covered in there. There's some rules beyond just standard SQL about how you use the SQL, but it really just boils down to SQL. And then the great thing is that you could, so I didn't get into this at all, but the enterprise connectors have caching functions, so you can cache things locally, a number of other advanced functionalities. If you scroll through the connection window, you can see all these functions in there, and if you go to the documentation, it covers all that in detail. So the great thing is that you can do, write the SQL following the rules about I need to, include a to email address or to in my SQL for the Twilio, right? So you could go and get a list of all the phone numbers from that other table, right? Get all the phone numbers and then include those in that right there. And then you can do a union between all those SQLs into one big database table, right? And so then you've gotten all of those, but that's something you need to understand about how the differences of what the API is expecting. And it's all covered in the documentation. You have to, so don't just think you can drop an FD connection on a form and connect to it and use it. You need to look into documentation. You need to understand the back end. But all of this stuff is stuff you should be able to figure out really, really quickly and get going with. So, spend some time reading the documentation. It's going to be way less than writing these components from scratch. And if you're writing from scratch, you'd have to read all the documentation on the API anyway. So you need to understand what's being abstracted, but at the end of the day, it is really, in my experience, has been occasionally I've not read the documentation, and then I go back and read the documentation. It's like, oh, that makes so much more sense now. So do read the documentation, and then yeah, it's great. It's easy to go, and you're able to get a lot done with these. So. All right, I think that's it. I got a message telling me it is almost top of the hour. I appreciate everybody joining us today, and hopefully you will enjoy your free enterprise connectors, and let everyone else know to join, watch the replay, and join us next month. And I should announce, that would be great if I announced what we're covering next month, but I don't have that right now, so I can't. But we will be posting a blog post about it shortly, so stay tuned to our new developer community site at adero.com/ or community.adero.com/developer-tools, and you will see what's coming there. And thank you so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you later. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye. Oh, if you are still here, I just forgot I was going to give you the link for the, I'll give you the handout for the slides. Choose a file. I had this all ready to go and then forgot to give you that. You'll get it through the, you can get it later as well through the replay link. So there you go. You should have a handout I just sent out to everybody with the slide deck in it as well. But you'll get a link for it too. So, all right, great. Thank you.